I made it my business to find out, Mr. Paxton. Just as I made it my business to find out about you and Mrs. Stewart. And that other little matter, of course.
What other little matter?
Why, the bat out of hell.
Hello? Hello, Miss Tracy, don't ring off.
I've typed the Bridgeley details, Mr. Paxton, but I shouldn't send them out yet. There's a council meeting.
I'm going out, Mary. If anybody telephones, tell them I shan't be back till tomorrow morning. Late tomorrow morning, about 11:30.
Yes, all right, Mr. Paxton.
Mark? Mark, are you there? It's Diana.
Diana!
Why didn't you answer the door? I've been ringing for ages.
I thought you'd been arrested.
Arrested?
Yes, someone telephoned the office and said... Let's go into the living room.
What's all this about being arrested about a phone call?
What happened this afternoon?
I didn't take your advice. I went to the motel.
What happened?
The police were there. They'd just found Jeffrey's body. Someone had taken it to the motel. You were right, of course. It couldn't have been Jeffrey on the phone. He's been dead since Monday.
Go on, Diana. Tell me exactly what happened.
Well, Clay took me back to the station. Of course, he was curious to know what I was doing at the motel. Well, at first I thought of lying to him, inventing some story about meeting a friend. In the end, I told him the truth.
In other words, Mrs. Stewart, you arrived at the motel expecting to meet your husband.
To tell you the truth, I didn't know what to expect. Thelma, Mrs. Bowen, said Jeffrey sounded absolutely desperate on the phone. I felt I had no alternative but to keep the appointment.
It never occurred to you that perhaps the best thing to do is to get in touch with me?
No, I'm sorry, it didn't. I was so worried, so confused, I didn't know what to do.
And you say that Mrs. Bowen was convinced, absolutely convinced, it was your husband who telephoned her?
Absolutely. She was sure it was Jeffrey.
I see. Thank you, Mrs. Stewart.
Inspector, could I ask you some questions now?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
How did you find out about my husband?
Well, I told you, we received an anonymous note. It arrived this morning by second post.
Have you any idea who sent this?
No, we haven't. Not yet. As you know, we found your husband's body in a ditch that runs between the Chichester Motel and the main road. It was covered with earth and leaves, and we had great difficulty in finding it. According to the doctor, it had been there about 48 hours, since the murder, in fact.
So you think my husband was murdered on Monday, the day he disappeared?
Yes, I do. I think he was shot on Monday, quite near the spot where Mr. Paxton dropped him, and then taken to the motel on Monday night, when everyone else was asleep.
Why take him to the motel? If you suspect the murder was committed near Allenbury, I fail to see...
I don't know why he was taken to the motel. Unless, of course, that's where the switch was made.
The switch?
With the clothes. You haven't forgotten the other man, Mrs. Stewart, the man at Benchley Wood.
Oh, no. Of course not. Well, who was he? Do you know?
Yes, we do. We identified him this morning. Does the name Harding mean anything to you, Mrs. Stewart?
Harding? No. Was that his name?
Yes, Ken Harding. He ran a betting shop at Oakfield, but the shop was just a front by all accounts. Mr. Harding had his finger in a great many pies.
Ken Harding? No, I've never heard of him.
I see. Thank you, Mrs. Stewart. Oh, Mrs. Stewart, forgive me for asking you this, but would you have described your husband as a wealthy man?
Yes. Yes, Jeffrey was quite well off. Yes, I suppose you would call him wealthy.
Apart from yourself, will anyone else benefit financially from your husband's death?
No, I don't think so. My husband made a new will about 2 years ago. Apart from a few small bequests, he left everything to me.
What do you call small bequests, Mrs. Stewart?
Oh, I believe he left Mrs. Houston, our housekeeper, £1,000. She'd been with Geoffrey for years. He was very fond of her.
I see. Mrs. Stewart, have you any idea at all, why anyone should have committed this murder?
No, Inspector, I haven't. To tell you the truth, my husband wasn't a very friendly sort of person. He had very few personal friends. On the other hand, as far as I know, he had no enemies.
Thank you, Mrs. Stewart. I appreciate your frankness. I'll see you out. If there are any further developments, we'll be in touch. Don't bother about the newspapers. Just refer them to me.
Just as I was leaving, Clay asked me the name of Geoffrey's solicitor. I told him it was Nigel Mills.
And that's all that happened?
Yes.
Well, I think you did well, Diana. Damn well, considering the circumstances. But this is quite different from what I expected. About an hour ago, a woman called Kitty Tracy telephoned me and said that you'd been arrested.
Kitty Tracy?
Yes, do you know her?
Oh, yes, she's got a shop in Station Street. Ned Talboy owns it. What is about a phone call? What happened?
Well, she started out by saying she'd got some information for me. She went on to say that you'd been arrested this afternoon at the motel.
God.
I asked her how she knew all this, and she said, I make it my business to find out these things, Mr. Paxton. I found out about you and Mrs. Stewart, for instance, and the bat out of hell.
Bat out of hell? That's what's on the cigarette case.
What's it mean, Diana?
I don't know what it means. I told you, I hadn't seen the cigarette case before, not till you showed it to me.
But it's got your name on it. It was in your coat pocket.
I know, Mrs. Houston put it there.
Mrs. Houston?
Yes, I asked her about it. She said she found it on the floor just after I'd taken my coat out of the wardrobe. She thought it had dropped out of one of my pockets. I told you before, and I tell you again, this is not my case.
All right, Diana, I believe you. But tell me about this woman, Kitty Tracy. Now, what do you know about her?
Well, not very much. Ned Talboy owns some property in Station Street, including Miss Tracy's sweet shop. I remember him speaking to Geoffrey one evening about her. He said she was a difficult tenant, that she was always behind in paying her rent, and she was always causing trouble.
What kind of trouble?
I don't know. And then another evening we were all having dinner together, and Thelma said that Miss Tracy had bought a lampshade from her that afternoon, and she really thought the old girl was going round the bend. I remember Ned saying, she's not going round the bend, Thelma. She just wants you to think she is.
What did he mean? She just wants you to...
Who's that? Well, hadn't you better answer it?
Go into the bedroom.
Good afternoon, Mr. Paxton. Sorry to disturb you, sir, but I called at your office and they said you just left.
Yes, I'm afraid I left rather early today.
May I come in for a moment, sir?
Oh, yes, of course.
Thank you. Your evening paper, sir, it was on the mat.
Oh, thank you. Is it too early for a drink, or can I get you a cup of tea, Inspector?
No, nothing for me, thank you, sir. I take it you've heard the news?
Yes, I have. Yes, I had to telephone Mrs. Stewart about 5 minutes ago, and she told me about this afternoon, the motel. My God, it must have been a terrible shock to her.
Yes, I'm afraid it was, but she's a very remarkable woman, is Mrs. Stewart. But this is what I wanted to see you about, sir. One of my chaps found it this afternoon, brought it to my office about 20 minutes ago.
That's Mr. Stewart's wallet.
Yes, I thought you'd recognize it.
Where was it found?
At Benchley Wood, curiously enough, not very far from the spot where we stood talking yesterday afternoon. I expect you've seen this before, too, sir.
Yes, I have. He used it for telephone numbers.
Amongst other things.
Other things?
Yes, he's jotted something else down here. T £100, T £300, T £450, T £900.
Well, I'm afraid I don't know what that means, Inspector.
Well, it's obvious what it means, sir. The question is, was the money received by Mr. Stewart or paid out by him?
Well, my guess is it was paid out.
Mine too, sir, which makes me rather curious.
Yes, well, I'm sorry I can't help you.
Well, I'll have a word with Mrs. Stewart about it. Perhaps she might be able to help. Oh, you don't happen to speak Italian by any chance, do you, Mr. Paxton?
No, I'm afraid not.
What about Mrs. Stewart?
No. Well, at least I don't think so.
Mr. Stewart?
No, I don't think he did either. Why do you ask?
Oh, it was just something we found in the wallet, something scribbled down on a piece of paper. I think it was Italian, but we're not sure. What a very nice flat you have here, Mr. Paxton. You've been here long, sir?
Only about a year, that's all.
Very pleasant.
Will you be dropping in on Mrs. Stewart this evening, Inspector?
No, I don't think so, sir. I think the poor woman's seen enough of me for one day. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Inspector.
Did he see it?
No, he didn't, but he damn well might have done.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry. I remembered it when I got to the bedroom. What was that about a notebook? Was it the one that Geoffrey kept in his wallet for phone numbers?
Yes, he'd written something down in it. The initial T followed by a list of money he'd received. Or paid out.
T?
Yes. I know what you're thinking. T for Tracy. I thought the same. Diana, whether we like it or not, we've got to do something about that woman. We've got to find out what she's up to.
Allenbury 7432.
Miss Tracy?
Yes, who's that?
My name is Stewart, Diana Stewart.
Oh, yes, Mrs. Stewart. Now, what can I do for you?
I believe you spoke to a friend of mine this afternoon about my husband.
Your late husband, Mrs. Stewart.
Miss Tracy, I'd like to talk to you. Do you think you could drop in on me one evening?
Well, I could, but I think I'd rather not, if you don't mind, dearie.
Oh.
But if it's a chat you want, just a little chat, why don't you drop round and see me sometime?
Yes, all right. When do you suggest?
Well, anytime you like, dearie. This evening.
Yes. Would 7 o'clock suit you?
Splendid. You know my little shop, I take it.
Yes, I do.
Well, just walk in. It'll say closed on the door, but take no notice of that. Just walk straight in.
Thank you, Miss Tracy.
Thank you, Mrs. Stewart.
Well, I think it's just ridiculous. What do we want another car for, anyway? What's the matter with the one we've got?
Well,
That's
of
what I'd
course,
like
it's
to
going to
know.
be difficult.
What do you mean difficult? It's me that's going to pay for the damn thing.
Yes, I thought we'd get round to that sooner or later.
Well, you're not disappointed. What sort of car is it, anyway?
A Bentley.
A Bentley?
Yes, but it's not a new one. It's 15 years old.
Walter, that hole in your head must be getting bigger every week. Don't you realise if people see you driving round in a Bentley...
Good afternoon, Thelma. Hello, Squire.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm all right. Have you brought the car?
Yes, it's outside. You ready?
I'm sorry, Ned, but I've changed my mind. I'm not interested.
What do you mean you're not interested? Now, look, Walter, I asked you last night whether you were serious about this, and you said to me...
serious? Have you driven the car?
No, not yet.
Well, what are we talking about? Take him for a run in it. You can't expect him to buy a car he hasn't been in.
No. No, of course not. Come along, old man. Hello, Inspector.
Good afternoon, sir.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mrs. Byrne. Could you spare me a few moments?
Yes, of course, Inspector.
Thank you.
Is there any news, Inspector? About Mr. Stewart, I mean.
Yes, I'm afraid there is. He's been murdered. We found his body this afternoon at the Chichester Motel.
You're quite sure it is Mr. Stewart,
Oh,
Inspector?
yes, we're quite sure, sir. Mrs. Stewart identified the body. She arrived just as we were leaving.
But surely she identified the other man, the man that was found at Benchley Wood.
Yes, she did, sir, but we can hardly blame her for that.
Why not, Inspector?
Well, the man at Benchley Wood was beaten up. His face was unrecognizable, but he was wearing Mr. Stewart's clothes. Under the circumstances, I think we'd have made the same mistake, sir.
Who is this man, Inspector?
His name is Harding, sir. Ken Harding. Have you heard of him?
No, I'm afraid I haven't, no.
Ken Harding. Now, that name's familiar. Didn't you introduce me to a man called Ken Harding?
No, I didn't.
But surely, Thelma, that man we met at Guildford, do you remember? He was in that antique shop the afternoon
His name wasn't Harding, it was Belling, Tom Belling. I've known him for years. Look, if you're going to try that car, Walter, you better try it.
Very well, Thelma.
And don't buy it. Just say you like it or you don't like it. I'll deal with Ned later.
In case you didn't get the message, Inspector, it's my wife who wears the pants round here.
Mr. Tallboy's trying to sell your husband a car.
Yes, a Bentley. 15 years old, for Pete's sake.
I saw it outside. It's in very good condition.
Yes, well, that's more than Walter will be if he buys it. What is it you wanted to see me about, Inspector?
It's about the phone call, madam. The one that you had from Mr. Stewart. Or rather, the man who called himself Mr. Stewart.
But I didn't have a phone call. Nobody telephoned me. It was Mrs. Stewart that had the call.
Mrs. Stewart?
Yes.
I wonder if you'd mind telling me what happened this morning.
Well, do I have to tell you, Inspector?
No, you don't have to tell me, madam. Don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to.
It isn't that I don't want to help you. It's just that, well, Mrs. Stewart's an old friend of mine. We've known one another for a very long time, and, well, I promised her I wouldn't say...
I think the circumstances have changed somewhat, Mrs. Bowen, don't you?
Yes, I suppose they have. Well, this morning after breakfast, I had a row with Walter, my husband. It was a silly little row. But when that happens, and it happens quite frequently these days, I'm afraid, I usually rush round to Diana's, Mrs. Stewart's, to let off steam. Well, as I said, it happened this morning. When I arrived at Diana's, I found she was in a far worse state than I was.
Go on, Mrs. Bowen.
Well, she said she just had a phone call from Geoffrey, her husband. He'd apparently told her he was in trouble, serious trouble, and that he wanted to see her this afternoon at the Chichester Motel. Diana said she didn't know what to do. Her instincts told her after what happened at Benchley Wood, she ought to get in touch with the police, and yet... Well, to cut a long story short, she finally made up her mind to keep the appointment and asked me to say nothing about the phone call to Walter or to anyone else.
I see. And I suppose there was no doubt in Mrs. Stewart's mind that it was her husband on the telephone?
No doubt at all. She was convinced of it. And that's what I don't quite understand, because we know now that it couldn't have been Geoffrey.
We do indeed. Well, thank you, Mrs. Bowen. You've been very helpful.
Inspector, wait a minute. What made you think it was me who received that telephone call?
Oh, it's just something Mrs. Stewart said, but I obviously got hold of the wrong end of
What did Mrs. Stewart say?
She said that you had received a call and that Mr. Stewart, or the man who called himself Mr. Stewart, asked you to deliver a message to her.
Asking her to meet him at the motel.
That's right, Mrs. Bowen.
But that isn't true. I didn't receive that phone call. Diana did. On earth should she lie to you, Inspector, about a thing like that?
Hello, Dawson. What are you doing here? Don't tell me you want another transfer.
No, sir. I thought you wanted to see me, Inspector. Sergeant Booth telephoned and said something
yes,
about...
of course. I was forgetting. You speak Italian, don't you, Dawson?
Well, a little bit, sir.
Well, what does this mean, Dawson? Can you translate it for me? It is Italian.
Oh, it's Italian, yes, but it's not easy to translate. What is it exactly?
Oh, it's just a note we found. What's it mean, Dawson?
Well, it simply says you came into my life like, well, very quickly.
Very quickly?
Yes, but that's not quite right. You came into my life like something quick, something,
Like a bat out of hell?
That's right, sir.
Here, you had better drink this. I wish to God you'd worn gloves.
I didn't think of it. Why should I? I didn't know what I was walking into.
But you're sure, you're quite sure that you didn't touch the knife?
Yes.
You sound doubtful.
I don't think I touched it.
You don't think? Diana, for God's sake, this is important. If you left your fingerprints on that...
I didn't touch it. I told you I didn't touch it.
Tell me again what happened.
I've told you twice already.
Tell me again, Diana.
When I went into the shop, I found...
No, start again at the beginning, the very beginning. You drove up in the car.
I parked the car across the road from the shop. There was no one in the street. It was quite deserted.
You're sure of that?
Yes. I went across to the shop. There was a closed sign on the door, but I took no notice of it. I went in.
Did the doorbell ring?
No, now you come to mention it, it didn't.
Go on.
Well, there was no one in the shop. I stood there for a moment wondering what to do. Then I noticed one of those bells on the counter, you know, those old-fashioned little bells. I rang it, but nothing happened. I saw there was a staircase at the back of the shop. I went towards it. I was about to go up it when I saw the knife.
Go on.
I was about to pick it up when I realized there was blood on it. And then I saw the shoe. I started up the stairs.
How far up?
What do you mean?
How far did you go up the staircase?
Oh, about 3/4 of the way, I suppose. And then I saw Thelma. She was on the landing. I screamed. I couldn't help myself. I knew immediately she was dead. I couldn't get out of that place fast enough.
Now listen, Diana, I know you touched the door when you entered the shop. And you touched the bell on the counter. But when you were climbing the staircase, did you touch...
What is it, Mrs. Houston?
It's the inspector.
Inspector Clay?
Yes. He'd like to have a word with you, madam, if it's possible.
Did you tell him I was in?
Yes, I did.
I didn't hear the bell, Mrs. Houston.
No, sir. I was in the hall and I saw him coming up the drive.
Oh, I see. I think perhaps you'd better see her, Mrs. Stewart.
Yes, all right, Mrs. Houston. Show him in. You know what's happened. They found
Be
Thelma's
quiet,
body.
Diana. Let me do the talking.
Good evening, Mrs. Stewart. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Inspector.
I'm sorry to bother you, madam, but I particularly wanted to have a word with you about that phone call.
Phone call? Oh, yes. The one Geoffrey, my husband, is supposed to have made.
That's right, madam.
Have you discovered who did make it, Inspector?
No, we haven't, Mr. Paxton, as a matter of fact. Mrs. Stewart, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember rightly, you said it was Mrs. Bowen who received the call.
That's right.
That she rushed round here to deliver a message to you.
Yes, that's quite right.
Well, I'm sorry, madam, that's not what Mrs. Bowen says.
Not what Mrs. Bowen says.
No, I'm afraid she doesn't confirm your story.
Do you mean there wasn't a phone call, Inspector?
Oh, yes, sir, there was a phone call, all right, but according to Mrs. Bowen, it was Mrs. Stewart who received it. She said that when she arrived here this morning, you were very upset. You said you'd had a phone call from your husband and didn't know what on earth to do about it.
That's not true. That's simply not true.
Well, I'm sorry, madam, I'm only repeating what Mrs. Bowen said.
When did you see Mrs. Bowen?
This afternoon, sir, just after I left you. I'd like to get to the truth about this phone call, Mrs. Stewart, because it seems to me to be important.
Excuse me, madam. It's Mr. and Mrs. Bowen.